All right, hello and welcome to everyone at home and in classrooms around the country to a session to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the Freedom Riders, presented by our friend, Jessie Hollis McCarthy from the Freedom Forum in Washington, D.C., and I will brag about her in just a minute. My name is Darby, and I'm joined by my colleague Sarah from EF, who will be monitoring the Q&A and the chat feature. So please ask questions if you have them. We would love to hear from you and should be able to address those at the end. So Jessie is not only awesome, but she is an outreach educator who has been with the Freedom Forum since July 2016. During her time with the education team, she has focused on expanding access to First Amendment education by developing educational content and programs to reach audiences around the world, literally around the world. She has led virtual trainings on 6 continents and is convinced that Antarctica will soon come knocking. Her recent conference presentations include The Challenge of Truth, Fact-Finding Historical Heroes, that is at the National Council for History Education, and Detecting Propaganda, Defeating Emotional Manipulation at the National Council for the Social Studies. Prior to joining the education team, she worked developing and teaching programming for a variety of museums and historic sites in the DC area. And with all of that impressive stuff said, Jessie, a big welcome. Thank you for being with us today, and we will now turn this over to you.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be joining you today, and I hope I live up to my introduction for this session. We're going to be talking about the civil rights movement as a First Amendment movement, and I'm going to invite you all into the work I do to look at these pieces of history through both their constitutional and legal lens, which I promise is not as complicated as it sounds, but also through their citizen-led movements or the people behind them and their historical significance. So we're going to be looking at the civil rights movement and the actions of the Freedom Riders specifically as we sit here in DC 60 years from their initial ride. But we'll also look at what that means and how people have used the language of the First Amendment throughout history. So let me share my screen. If at any point you have a thought that you want to put in the chat or you have a question you want to ask, please feel free to do so. I try and keep an eye, and I have plenty of people with me to help make sure I don't miss your questions and thoughts. So what will we be talking about in our time together? Well, we'll define civil rights, what it means, and when I say it, what I'm talking about. And the definition is broad and it means a lot of things to a lot of people. So we want to include those. We'll talk about the First Amendment and what the law says that allows people in the United States to express themselves, and then how to read the First Amendment usage in the civil rights movement. So we'll look at a couple key pieces and again, focus in on the Freedom Riders. When I ask what are civil rights, we're really asking what does this term mean? How do people use it? What does it mean to people in the United States and across the world? And if you have a thought on what civil rights, or you want to share what civil rights means to you when you hear that term, feel free to put it in the chat. I'll keep an eye out for your ideas. But we know that this is something we've seen people advocating for throughout history, and it's often tied to these large movements that we record in our press and in our history books as well. So, not ignoring anyone who's sharing thoughts in the chat for what civil rights mean, we have to think about it in complex ways. So we see people here on the screen. These are the silent sentinels advocating for women's suffrage. They're asking for the legal right to vote, and that's a civil right. But not everything is contained in the specifics of, I want this law or I want this law to change. They can be more broad. They could be cultural. Now, why am I starting with this image of the suffragettes? Well, this is the first group, the Silent Sentinels, to picket the White House. This is where the story starts for protesting in front of this federal building, and this is in the early 20th century. When we think about First Amendment language, people borrow from those who came before. Hey, they did that. That was effective in bringing about the change they wanted. we should do that too. And we can turn on the news for the past 100 years. We can look at the past 100 years. And while they may have been the first to picket in front of the White House, we know they are not the last. And that's the thing, when we think about civil rights, what we record of it is people using their free expression rights to advocate for these changes. So when I say civil rights for the purposes of this presentation, what am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about 4 specific things. And I'm going to be talking about political rights. So the right to vote, the right to run for office, the right to have our political systems represent the ideas and causes and actions that are important to us. And we also want to talk about legal rights, the right for the laws to be fair, the right for protections through the legal space, the right to vote or the right to own property, the right to have a trial by jury, and all of these things. So those are the legal rights, the right for the law to not discriminate against anyone. But we also have to think really big picture too, because civil rights can go beyond the things we write down on paper and put into our governmental systems. They can be social rights, the right to associate, the right to marry, the right to exist peacefully and safely in society, and economic rights, the right to having a job that you're qualified for and having fair hiring practices, the right to being paid for one's work. And I have on the screen 4 different civil rights causes or civil rights moments. From the political, where we see the Native American protest and occupation of Alcatraz Island in the top left, to suffragette Dr. Mabel Pinghua Lee, who was also a minister in her advocacy as well. And if you're going, wait a second, I know of other civil rights leaders who are also religious leaders, that's something we're going to see. We're going to see these overlaps in how people use the First Amendment to advocate for their causes. We're going to see social moments like the Lovings down in the bottom right-hand corner, whose Supreme Court case ended bans on multiracial marriages. And we even see civil rights movements from workers. Worker strikes are advocating for fair treatment of workers. And here we see Mexican and Mexican American farm workers in 1933 advocating for fair labor practices in the agricultural industry in the American West. So civil rights are expansive, and how people advocate for them is expansive too. And who's advocating for these civil rights are the people who are asking for them. And as you can see, just from this slice of 20th century, there's a lot of causes that are important to people that they want to see change brought about. Now, the framers of our Constitution thought about what rights do people need to express themselves and to put a check on their government, to ask for change, to make sure the government reflects the things they want. And they thought very hard about this, and they came up with 5 essential freedoms that people in the United States need. And you notice I keep saying people in the United States and not citizens, because this law is expansive. It applies to anyone in the United States. If you're physically here, the First Amendment protects you. And these 5 freedoms they gave us give us a really kind of broad way to communicate and express ourselves in the United States. We have the right to our deepest beliefs under freedom of religion. We have the right to express ideas, political, artistic, cultural, under freedom of speech. We have the right to publish and share our ideas with others in forms of mass communication or distribution. We have the right to peacefully gather together. And we also have the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. We can tell them when we do or don't like what they're doing. And so we see these 5 freedoms bound together in this one law. Now, I told you that you were going to be learning to read civil rights movement moments through this law. So keep these 5 freedoms in mind and think about what they mean. That religion is something that people have the right to practice free from a government establishment, meaning the government can't declare an official religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So people can practice their religion how they want. We have freedom of speech, the right to say whatever we want. And it's not just spoken words, it's wearing a button on our shirt or making a sign or singing a song or producing a piece of art. It's even the choice to remain silent. We have the right to share ideas with each other, how press can not only just be about sharing information or in the form of reporting or sharing opinions in the form of something like an editorial or a blog post. It can also be a way of recording what's going on. We have the right peacefully to assemble. It's one that comes with a caveat. We have to stay peaceful when we gather together, but what can we achieve as multiple people that maybe a single voice would find more difficult? And we can petition the government in a variety of ways. We can sign a literal petition. We can petition the court on whether a law is constitutional or not, or we can protest. And so we see these 5 freedoms working together to form ways and create expression. Now, 2 things to remember about the First Amendment before we move forward. 1, it only protects us from the government, not our friends from getting mad at us for the things we say. And 2, restrictions on the First Amendment, and there are some, have to be content neutral. It doesn't tell us what's a good idea to say or what's a good idea to write or what religion to believe. It doesn't do that. It's content neutral. It's not a good idea, bad idea law. It's a yes, no. So we can say things that are mean. Are they nice? Are they a good idea? Maybe not, but the law doesn't make that call. So it's important to remember those things about the First Amendment as we look at these historical moments. Before I move forward, because I just threw constitutional law at you, does anyone have any questions? You're welcome to put those in the chat or the question and answer box. Right. I will keep an eye out in case any questions come in, but let's get to the history of what we're talking about today. So, when I say the civil rights movement, I mean a very specific period of time in the quest for Black Americans to access equal civil rights, those 4 categories we talked about earlier, throughout American history. And when we say the civil rights movement, we're talking about a pretty specific period. Is it the start of this advocacy? No. Is it the end of this advocacy? No. We're looking at a single piece in the timeline of this history. And it's marked by a couple things. It's really kind of sandwiched between 2 important laws. When I say the civil rights movement, and when others say it too, they're really talking about this time period from 1954 to 1965. And it starts with a really important Supreme Court ruling that overturns a historical ruling establishing the constitutionality of segregation by race. And we see that Supreme Court ruling is the first chip in breaking apart that earlier ruling that allows things like the segregation laws in the American South and across the United States. And in 1964 and 65, we're going to see the passage of acts protecting people from having their rights limited or taken away on the basis of race. Now, to read this like a First Amendment scholar, we have to think about how do people advocate for these changes? We can petition the court to reconsider a law, which is what happens in Brown versus Board of Education. They ask the Supreme Court to reconsider whether it is constitutional to separate children in schools on the basis of race. And it overturns Plessy versus Ferguson, that earlier court ruling that establishes the idea of separate but equal. Now, we see this petition to the court, but what did Homer Plessy do to start his court case? Well, Homer Plessy was a multiracial individual. He was culturally from the Creole culture in Louisiana, and he, as a multiracial individual, sits down on a train car in a designated whites-only train car, seeing segregation laws starting to form in the late 1800s, and asks, "Where do I sit?" He effectively refuses to give up his seat. He was already an active member of movements thinking about this, and that starts the famous court case. In 1955, Rosa Parks does something similar. When seated on a bus, she is asked to move to give up her seat for a white passenger and refuses. This moment of civil disobedience, which we have to remember there's some conflicting laws on the books in Montgomery at the time, while they do have these segregation laws on the basis of the Plessy versus Ferguson case. There's also a law on the books that says no one can be asked to give up their seat, regardless of their race. So we see this moment for her. And yes, remember how we started with the suffragettes picketing in front of the White House? We see parallels in how people use the First Amendment. We can read that when we look at these historical moments. Rosa Parks used her speech. She used petition to make a stand on this moment, just as Homer Plessy did about 70 years earlier. So when we read the civil rights movement, we can look for these examples of those 5 freedoms in action. I've got the whole timeline up so you can see where we're moving through that 1954 to 1965 time period. But we're going to jump forward to 1961. And if you're tired of hearing about Supreme Court cases, well, unfortunately, you're going to be hearing about some more. It's important. Remember, petitioning the court is one of our freedoms. So in 1961, a multiracial group of activists decides to challenge the lack of enforcement on 2 Supreme Court cases. The first one is the 1946 case, Morgan versus West Virginia, where the court rules that segregated seating on buses is unconstitutional. And if you're having a moment going, wait, that's Supreme Court rulings from 1946, what happened with Rosa Parks in 1955? That's 9 years later. Shouldn't that have not been a problem? That's the question the Freedom Riders are asking. Are they putting these Supreme Court cases, these rulings into action to disrupt and dismantle these segregation laws across the United States? There's a second case that renews this interest and consideration in 1960 called Boynton versus Virginia, which it says segregating any interstate transportation facilities like bus terminals, buses, ticketing counters, food courts, the equivalents there, are unconstitutional. So this group boards the bus in Washington, D.C., with the goal of riding across state lines, sitting together in multiracial pairs, so normally a Black activist and a white activist paired together, to see if someone will try and separate them. And this picture should tell you the risks that members of the Freedom Rides faced. You see armed National Guard accompanying them on a later Freedom Ride for their safety. We also notice that this is coming and supported by 2 assembled groups, the CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, and SNCC, a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. There are groups behind this that are helping these activists organize to challenge to see whether these laws are being enforced or not. When they leave Washington, D.C., and many of the other freedom rides, we see them advocating and talking about what they are hoping to achieve. Here you see a group of freedom riders, not our first one from 1961 leaving here in DC. There were many freedom rides talking about why they're doing this. You can see what's on their signs. So I want us to think about this from the First Amendment. So everyone get your chat pulled up. I want you to start thinking like First Amendment historians and tell me, the freedom riders organizing on these buses were using which of their 5 freedoms? Can you spot them? So take a moment, share out in the chat, which of the 5 freedoms do you think the freedom riders used as they advocated for these changes and the enforcement of these Supreme Court rulings to desegregate bus travel. All right, I'm already seeing some answers coming in. Absolutely. So I see assembly and speech, definitely. There wasn't one person, it was an assembled group. That's why they're called the Freedom Riders, plural. And speech, those posters they made, sitting in those seats, those are all forms of expressing themselves through speech. Any other freedoms involved? I'm going to go backwards 2 slides to give you a big hint. Which freedom are they using to make sure people know what they're doing? Yeah, this one's press. John Lewis, who was one of the freedom riders, Representative Lewis, said, without the American press, the civil rights movement would have been like a bird without wings. What he's talking about is, if you do these things, you want people to know what you're doing so they can understand what you're asking for, the change you're asking for. Wait a second, what's one of the freedoms we use to ask for change? When we ask the government to change what they're doing or even to stop change, which freedom is that? Awesome. I see it already coming into the chat. Petition. They were using 4 of the 5 freedoms. And that's the thing. When we look at these historical moments, when we look at how people advocate and ask for these civil rights changes they're looking for, when we know the law, we can actually read how they made the decisions to create these moments. And you can do this for anything. You can look at famous moments in history where people are asking for a change and read what they're doing. Look, pop quiz. Dr. Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" and the March on Washington. What freedoms was he using for his famous "I Have a Dream" and March on Washington? Anyone want to share out in the chat? Yeah, he was giving a famous speech, the "I Have a Dream" speech. He wasn't just giving a speech, he was actually using a constitutional right to advocate for change. And we can do this as we read these. Assembly, a march is an assembly. Absolutely. Is it coincidence that in the beginning when I showed Dr. Mabel Pinghua Lee and Dr. King were both religious leaders? Religious leaders have access to communities who assemble for religious practices, often once a week, though not always, depending on the faith. Religion as a space of advocacy. They're all woven together. And when we look at history, if we're looking at a moment, we can actually read it through these 5 freedoms to help us understand how people made these moments in our legal history, but also in our cultural history. Now, we also can't talk about the freedom riders without talking about the risks these people took to use these freedoms to advocate for change. And the first freedom ride does face violent reaction from mostly white Americans throughout the American South. The first bus on May 14th, 1961 is firebombed outside Anniston, Alabama. And here you can see this image. The Freedom Riders managed to escape, though injured. And the other bus, they're attacked in the Birmingham bus terminal by a mob and injured. 6 days later, as they pass the state capitol, there's another assault on the Freedom Riders. These advocacy moments aren't without risk. These are the first 2 freedom rides in the 1961, but we see others that attempt these same forms of advocacy to make sure these Supreme Court rulings, these laws, are enforced throughout areas with segregation laws, and to challenge those segregation laws to get them off the books as they are unjust to the people living in the United States. Lewis, who was on this ride, says, "We never staged anything for the sake of the press, but we didn't want to be attacked in the dark of the night. If we were going to be attacked, we wanted it to be done when people were watching, so they understood the severity of the changes we were asking for." Now, I want to take a moment to open it up to you. Do you have any questions on this period or on reading civil rights through the lens of the First Amendment? Or even if you don't have a question and just want to share a thought that's come to you, I'm happy to hear those as well. So feel free to put those in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll be monitoring them. How many people were in the bus? I want to say that it was 2 groups of 8. Don't quote me on that number. It's not a huge group of people. I want to say it's between 13 and 16 on the buses. So 4 pairs. Remember, they're trying to book public transportation. Some of the freedom rides were bigger, some were smaller. How did they firebomb the bus? So in the instance of the Anniston case, this was a local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan was behind the attack. They escorted the non-Freedom Rider passengers off the bus, sealed the door and held it shut, and put in combustibles. So, you know, bottles with flammable liquids that had been ignited onto the bus. All the Freedom Riders are managed to escape safely. No one dies in this attack, but you can see the devastating effect of the firebombing. The challenge for the Freedom Riders is as they seek medical attention, they had been promised safety by the governor of Alabama at the time, but he rescinds that protection. So as they go to hospitals, many of the hospitals refuse to treat the Black Freedom Riders, only willing to admit the white Freedom Riders. And so as a group, they refuse medical treatment until they find medical facilities willing to treat them as an integrated group. Coming in with the tough historical questions. I appreciate that. This is the space to talk about them.
Jessie, are any of the Freedom Riders still alive today?
Yeah, many of the Freedom Riders are still alive today, including from this first ride. Dr. Rip Patton, I believe, is still in the DC area, and he's one of the Freedom Riders. It's also important to remember that this is one of dozens of freedom rides, and it's not actually the first. After that 1946 case, Morgan versus West Virginia, we see sort of a precursor and inspiration piece to these later freedom rides. Remember, we borrow the language of the past to help us form our expression today. And so some of the people from even that first one are still alive. And it's also important to remember the First Amendment doesn't come with an age restriction. You must be this old to freely express. No, many activists throughout American history were very young when they took on their advocacy. A lot of the freedom riders were 18, 19, 20 years old. So they were not particularly, I will say, aged when they took these on. Many people were young advocates. And I want to leave with this. The expression we make, that expressing our ideas is important. Here we see a quote from President Johnson from a phone call to Dr. King, where he asks if you can find the worst condition where you see Black Americans being denied the right to cast a vote, and if you can take that one moment and use the First Amendment, that illustration, get it on radio, get it on television, get it every place you can, pretty soon the fellow that didn't do anything but drive a tractor will say, well, that's not right. That's not fair. And then that will help us on what we are going to shove through in the end. President Johnson is talking about the importance of civil advocacy by people in the United States to affect changes to our laws. So we have to think about it. It's not just a matter of reading how these people made their movements and how these movements were formed, but also how it does what the law is intended to do. Let people in the United States check their government and ask for the changes that they want. that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And of course, I'll take any other questions that we have time for, but I'll also turn it over to my colleagues for any last notes.
Sure. I just would like to say, Jesse, so glad to have you with us today. It's such a pleasure, and you're doing amazing work at the Freedom Forum. We love having you as a guest each and every time. I'm so glad to have you back. I learned a lot today, and I know that everyone at home did too. So thank you so much. So
Thank you.
anything else from your side?
No, but thank you. This was incredible and such a starting point for all of the work that I think we're seeing a lot of echoing through today. So it's really relevant and helpful to understand and put it in a really fantastic context. So thank you.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully now everyone can go forth and read events both in the past and the present through the lens of the First Amendment to dive deeper into the understanding of how fellow Americans are advocating.
Awesome. Jesse, thanks again. And thanks to everyone at home for tuning in. We appreciate it, and have a wonderful weekend.
Bye.
Bye-bye.